Welcome to Sound Meets Sound. Welcome to the Sound Meets Sound podcast. Today, our guest is Regina Baiocchi. I'm very honored to have you on here. You're the only person I've interviewed so far that is already in a history book. I'm holding up From Spirituals to Symphonies by Helen Walker Hill. Please go pick up that book and read about Regina's life. Maybe you could just introduce yourself and sort of describe the many things that you do as an artist.
Thank you, Meg. My name is Regina Baiocchi. I am a composer, an author, and a poet. And basically, I write music and words, sometimes together, sometimes separate. I really love writing poetry, fiction, nonfiction, creative nonfiction mostly. And I'm happy to see you hold up Helen Walker Hill's book because you have the second edition.
Yes.
And in case you have not seen the first edition, I'm actually on the cover. And my mother loves that photograph of me. I look like I'm 12 years old. I think I was in my 30s when I took the photograph. It always reminds me of her. And I stopped using it because my webmaster told me that he thought I used the photo too much. I'm a composer who also writes words. People often ask me, why don't I choose one? And I basically liken it to choosing a part of your body to leave at home when you go someplace. You wouldn't chop off your right arm because you're only going to be around left-handed people. So why would I leave Regina the poet at home because I'm, have a concert? Or why would I leave Regina the composer home because I have a poetry reading? So that is who I am. That is who I've been most of my life. Most of the time I enjoy doing all three. It just dawned on me when I made the left-handed comment. My dad used to be left-handed, and he was born in the 30s. And left-handed people were thought of as people who were possessed by the devil. In other words, you're writing with the devil's hand. And so he told me stories about how the teacher would sometimes tie his hand behind his back so he would be forced to write with his right hand. Then they started hitting his left hand and doing all that. So I brought that up because I think I just made that connection now. Maybe that's what prepared me not to bend to people's whims. Because a lot of teachers have said to me, well, what are you doing writing poetry? You should be concentrating on your string quartet. Or why are you doing this? You should be concentrating on your piano piece or your clarinet piece. And to have to keep explaining it over and over again, it gets a little tiresome. At the same time, it gives me an opportunity to speak about other projects that I'm writing on. So I try to look for the silver lining in everything.
How I knew you at first was on Twitter. Your handle is Haiku Fest.
Yes.
I am curious how Haiku Fest became a thing and what inspired you to do it.
When I was 7 years old, I wrote my mother a poem, and it's a horrible little poem that I can never forget. It's always swimming around in my head. And I think it's one of those things that it's kind of like an anchor to remind me no matter how many awards I win or no matter how great the public may think I am, I'm still who I am. I'm still me. She read in the newspaper that Gwendolyn Brooks was doing a poetry reading here in Chicago. And she took me and she said, I want you to read your poem to Miss Brooks because it's so beautiful. I have always been painfully shy all of my life. I know the exact day that I came out of my shell was right after undergrad. My very first professional job was teaching math. And I went to write on the board and every piece of chalk that I picked up broke. Every piece of chalk. And the kids were laughing, of course, This was junior high school, and I taught kids between the ages of 12 and 14. Now they call it middle school. But anyway, back to this poetry thing. I went to the Museum of Science and Industry, a huge place in Chicago, and Gwendolyn Brooks was there with all of these kids. There must have been 1,000 kids now looking back, because as I've gone as an adult, she generally attracts, large crowds. And she would listen to kids read their poetry all day long. And then at the end, she would give cash awards for the best poems, usually first, second, and third place. And she called me up to read my poem. And instead of going to the microphone, I went to her where she was sitting because I didn't want to speak to the microphone. And I just kind of whispered to her, and I had a lot of practice at this, even at 7. I can't read in the microphone, but could I just show you the poem? And she said, "Oh, darling, no, everyone wants to hear it." And I said, "I can't. It's not going to work." I knew I would start crying or whatever. And so she said, "Well, would you like for me to call you up later?" I said, "Sure." So I waited until all 999 other kids read. My mother was looking at her watch like, it's almost dinner time. You got to get up there and read. I have 7 siblings, by the way. So these all the kids that were born were probably sitting at home saying, "It's dinner time. Where are they?" I never did go to the microphone, but I did go up to her afterwards and I read the poem to her, and I cried the entire time. And I think she gave me like a mercy award because the poem was terrible, but my mother assures me that the poem was great, and it was great for a 7-year-old. And
Oh,
she opened her pocketbook and took out cash money and gave it to me, and I was like, "Oh my God." That just left such an impression on me. She was nice enough to mentor me throughout her life. As time grew on, we got closer and closer. And when I started teaching elementary school, junior high school, basically, I invited her to my school during Black History Month. That whole invitation morphed into just this huge program that went on for hours and hours. And she sat there from 1 p.m., which is her starting time. She was supposed to end at 2, because at 2:30 the kids were dismissed. She was there till 10:30 that evening, signing autographs,
wow.
reading, listening to kids. And I kept saying, "Miss Brooks, would you like to take a water break or potty break?" And she was like, "No, darling, if these kids want to get in line for this chicken scratch, or if they want to hear me read, I'll just stay here till somebody kicks me out." That left an impression on me, obviously. And by then I was in my 20s. Years later, when she passed, they did a tribute to her. And Hakeem Adabuti, who is like her cultural son, asked me to write an essay. It's part of a book that he published called Gwendolyn Brooks and the Working Writers, or something to that effect. And I wrote about this incident because every time I saw her, she would say, "Remember that time I came to your school and I was there till 10:30?" And it was like, and she would always tell that story, but it was like with such great fondness,
Right.
and I, as so when she passed, I thought other people would take up that mantle. I thought they would do the program that she did at the Museum of Science and Industry. I talked to her daughter about it. I talked to Haki Matabuti about it, and no one really seemed interested in doing that. And I thought it was a very important thing to do because I know what it did for me.
Right.
I am a firm believer that if my mom had not taken me to the Museum of Science and Industry that day, I probably would not be writing poetry for public consumption. I would be one of those closet poets, and there are many of us. People who write poetry knowing that they'll never ever share it with anyone, but it's something that they love to do or they feel they have to do. And I wanted to give kids an option. So that's how I founded Haiku Festival. She passed, I believe, in 2000, and Haiku Festival was born in 2004. As a matter of fact, this year, 2020, is our Sweet 16 anniversary. And we had really great things planned, did a lot of workshops. We always have a culminating event, is always an awards program at the end of the year. Well, at the end of the school year, sort of, during April, which is National Poetry Month. And we're down at Harold Washington Library. And even that is just a historic thing. Harold Washington was the first Black mayor of Chicago. And he and Miss Brooks were good friends, and she wrote his inauguration poem each time he was inaugurated. So it was nice when they invited me to come down there because initially we didn't have a home. We went to different libraries, and as we started to grow, we went to regional libraries. Chicago has 3 regional libraries, and they're strategically placed. One is downtown, which is where Harold Washington is, and then one is on the south side and one is on the north side. So we did the north side regional, we did the south side regional. We went to as many libraries that we could get to do our programs, to do readings, to do workshops, and then we just kind of outgrew everything. And I'm so happy to be able to say that because we started with 75 kids, and last year we had, a couple thousand. So
Wow.
it's nice to be able to grow. not so much for quantity's sake, but just to know that because of Miss Brooks, I'm able to celebrate children's poetry and promote literacy at the same time.
And I didn't realize that Haiku Fest was essentially extending this legacy from Gwendolyn Brooks. It sounds like, you're saying no one really wanted to pick up where she left off. That's really amazing that it has that connection to her and to your own experience.
It's a lot of work. And her daughter, Nora Brooks Blakely, had a theater company, a children's theater company called Chocolate Chips. And so she knew how much work it would be. And I think that's why she was like, and she's not really a poet. I know she's written some poetry, but it seemed like a natural thing for Haki to do. But he really, as far as an educator is concerned, he really has made a name for himself in academia in undergrad and graduate studies. He founded the Gwendolyn Brooks Black Writers Center, the only Afrocentric MFA program in the country.
Wow.
Not an easy feat, because what academic hurdles you have to jump over and what hoops you have to jump through on a daily basis to put together an accredited MFA. That is something else. But I'm happy to see that the program is still going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because any kid who starts in Haiku Festival conceivably could go and get an MFA in African American poetry or a Master's of Fine Arts in poetry writing. In a way, we're kind of complementing each other, each doing what he or she does best.
Giving children opportunities like that, like you had, like you said, it can be really transformative, life-changing for them, as little people to be able to express themselves and have someone listen. And I just love that she just opened up her pocketbook right there for shy little Regina.
And it wasn't a purse, it was a pocketbook. I was like, whoa. And I think I walked around with that, I don't know what it was, $10 or $20 or whatever, because I think the first prize may have been $50 then. And today, by today's standards, we give $100. She didn't do what I did. The sky was the limit with her. You could write in any form you wanted to. I limited mine to haiku for selfish reasons. I love haiku. I love micropoetry. I love small forms. And I guess a part of me thought that one day this would get so big that I would have to be able to manage it. And then the other thing is I wanted to make sure if I'm going to give an award based on merit, that I'm judging apples and apples. I don't see how I can say this sonnet won first place, but this haiku won second place, because in a sonnet, you have so much more room to express yourself. You are bound by some rules, but there's still a lot of room. But we have some pretty strict rules. It has to be 575. We loosened the nature rein because I've written books, urban haiku, blues haiku. I think it's important for people to write about what they know, where they are, or what they want to become. And so that doesn't always mean you write about nature. And when I look at, some of the haiku masters, who, by the way, some of them were taught by women, but you never hear their names.
Right.
But you can read it in my book if I ever finish it. But when I do my haiku workshops for teachers and adults, I do a whole segment on women. And there's a guy who I believe he's at UCLA. His entire doctoral studies was taken up with haiku by women, starting from the beginning of time up until now. He's published like 40 books on the topics. So there's a lot of material out there just from that one man. If you start from him, you could spend your entire life just reading haiku by women. I think it's important for people to know that anyone can write anything. And I like haiku because it's brief. I can read 2,000 of them comfortably. I don't think I can read 2,000 free-form poems comfortably because I just don't think I could.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, and like you said, comparing apples to apples, what criteria do you put on free-form poetry to compare it to another? That does seem like a lot of work to do, and it's every year, right? So
yes,
that's a
yes.
it's a whole job.
And throughout the throughout the year, like from October through June, we're in the schools doing work. And when I say we, I'm mostly the we who's in the schools doing these workshops. I try to limit them to Tuesday through Thursday from 10 until 2. That's a large chunk of time. Luckily for me, people, you know, if my average is 1 to 2 a week, and I can still manage that. I can still write my music. I can still, prepare dinner. I can still uh, think about cleaning up my apartment. But it's manageable.
I think in the Helen Walker Hill, she mentions how you came to poetry and writing first, and then it wasn't that long afterwards that you came to music. So I guess I'm curious to hear. We've heard your origin story now with poetry and writing. I'd like to hear the origins of how you've decided to make and create music.
Well, she's kind of right in a way, in the sense that I started writing poetry when I was 7, and I started writing music when I was 10. But my first introduction to music was when I was 4 years old. My mother, I have 4 sisters, 2 of whom are older than I am. And for a while, we were known as the 3 big ones when my mother had 6 kids. And then there were the 3 little ones. So the 3 big ones would go to church together because, my mother, I used to tease her about it. When I was a kid, I thought every woman was like eternally pregnant because that's how I saw her.
Right.
Either she was just had a baby or was having a baby, or she was always in that state. And so she kept us regimented. And I look back now, I think the reason she exposed us to so many things is because otherwise she would have just been a basket case. But one of the things that I did with my 2 older sisters, my mother, who sang in the church choir, had us audition for a community chorus called the Girls Choir. The Girls Choir was probably about 4 or 5 blocks from home I was raised in a Roman Catholic church. But it's the oldest Black Catholic church in Chicago. So it looks very different from if you walked into a non-Black Catholic church. But anyway, so we were in the girls' choir, and I auditioned when I was 4 years old. When I was 4 years old, my voice was as deep as it is now. I was a true alto. Oh, yeah. I could growl down there. And when I opened my mouth to sing, all of the girls just howled. They were like, she sounds like Froggy. My older sister stood up, and she was very tall for her age. And she stood up, and they stopped. The crowd just hushed, And I said, okay, I might be able to get through it. And then my second oldest sister, who was just like the baddest kid on the block, nobody ever messed with her. I mean, they just didn't do it. They just didn't do it.
Right.
Anyway, she stood up on the other side of me, and they both had their hands on their hips, like, let her get through her audition. And the director, who was, playing the piano, he looked at both of them, and then I guess he thought, well, I better get busy too.
Right.
So he started playing, and I did my little audition. And it was one of those auditions where, unless you just had a 10 ear, I think everyone probably got in. I think he held the auditions just to know whether you were going to be first, second, or third soprano, or first, second, or third alto. And that was another thing. We sang in, anywhere from 3 to 6 parts. He was serious. When I look back now, I was like, man, we did a lot of things. And I just remember always singing all of the parts. Like if they would get off, I would start singing their part, and he would say, is there someone in the alto singing the second soprano part? Well, yeah, they sang F sharp. It should have been F natural, is what I wanted to say, but of course I didn't say anything. So that was my first musical experience at 4 years old. And I think as a result, I use my voice to write music. I know a lot of people write at the piano. I tend to write with my voice, regardless of what instrument I'm writing for. I think the only instrument family that I don't use my voice to write for is non-pitch percussion instruments. Those I tend to hear the rhythms, and they kind of stay in that ear until I write them down. But the other things, I work them out either humming or singing on some syllable or whatever. And I think it's because he made me feel comfortable hearing my voice.
And I like how you're saying you could hear the mistakes essentially that others were making. Like that should be an F.
Well, that's one of the things he trained us to do because he was very big on if you cannot hear the other parts, you're either too loud or you're not paying attention. So paying attention was not just being quiet while he was going over other parts, but it was also listening while you were performing. And that sounds so easy, but you as a musician know that that's a very difficult thing. But I think what it did for me as a young child is that it taught me self-discipline. If you can teach someone self anything. And I remember this guy, and as an adult, I went back and I found him and I called him, and he was probably in his 70s or 80s at the time. I talked to him, and he was so happy that someone called him and said, "Hey, I used to be in the girls' choir." And, because when I remember a friend of mine who was a member of a group that I founded called 6 Degrees, we were talking one day and we were driving down the street, and she said, "Oh, I remember that church. Metropolitan was the name of the church. It was a AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church." And she said, "I used to go there when I was a kid." And I said, "Oh, did you?" I said, "I live not too far from here." And she said, "Well, this wasn't my church. I just went there because I belonged to a choir." And I said, "Was it the girls' choir?" And she said, "Yes, the girls' choir." I said, "I was in the girls' choir." And she was like, "You were," but it was so big that, if someone, I remember as a kid, we played a game like when we couldn't sleep, we would name all the kids in our classroom. I know it sounds silly, but
That's
if
cute.
someone asked me to name all the kids in the girls' choir, I couldn't do it. It was so big.
Yeah.
And we sat down and thought about it. And then later, when I talked to Mr. Webb, who was the choir director, he told me that there were times when the group was as large as 1,000.
Wow.
He said the average was, 300 to 500. And so my friend and I, Ann Ward, we figured out that our group was probably somewhere between the 300 to 400 range. Just judging from the size of the church. And it was so weird because she didn't belong to that church, but that's where they had her memorial service. And when I walked in there, I thought, oh my God,
Wow.
she's back here at this place. And it's a church that's kind of in the round. It's a real good place for worship. It's a real good place for singing. Whoever is speaking or singing, they're right dead center. And it's just, there's not a bad seat in the house. It was kind of like what she would have liked because she was very Afrocentric in her teaching. She did a thing every day to start her classes called Morning Circle, where the kids would actually sit in a circle and come together with either percussion instruments or their bodies and just kind of open their day and center themselves before the day started. And I kind of felt that at her memorial service. And of course, I wrote a poem that they invited me to read, or they invited me to read something, and I wrote a poem.
I'm very curious about, as I am with all composers, how you decided I'm going to make my own music now and how that sort of came about and what kind of pieces you were writing. Does this start as a child?
Well, as I mentioned, my mother sang in church choirs. My father played bluegrass fiddle and harmonica. And when we were kids, we hated that. We hated it. Hated it.
I saw that in the
Chicago.
book.
Oh yeah, Chicago's a big blues town. And my father was from Kentucky. And so he and his three brothers, he had three brothers, they all played bluegrass music together. And their mother, my paternal grandmother, was an organist. She played by ear. They all played by ear. I don't think any of them read. And so when we had family gatherings, they would have these jam sessions. Well, if you are growing up in the 60s and 70s and Motown is all the rage, you don't want your friends seeing your father playing in a band where somebody's playing a washboard or a jug. It's like, no, no, no.
Right.
And my father he was real cool about putting up with our idiosyncrasies. Like he had a 1948 Dodge. And we were like, oh my God, where did you get this ugly car? And did you bring this as a joke? We were so embarrassed by that car that we actually talked him into driving a block or two, and we would meet them and get in the car. And sometimes we would be running late, and we would say, "Okay, I'll meet you." And he's like, "Get in the car." Get in the car. And these kids, they came up with this song called "Ain't That Your Father's Car?" And they would sing it every time. It's like you would look out, there's nobody out, and as soon as you walk towards that car, a bunch of kids would come out of nowhere singing, "Hey, ain't that your father's car?" But anyway,
That's great.
oh my God. So, so my father actually, every year we got the same thing for Christmas: a book, a toy, and a bag of fruit.
Oh.
I didn't realize, how that was like a pauper's Christmas. I thought it was kind of cool, actually. But anyway, so one year I got this guitar, and my sister got a zither. It didn't dawn on me until later that he was putting together his own little jam session. You know what I mean? Because zither is a very folk instrument. Something you would hear in bluegrass music. Anyway, so I got this guitar, and they have a little book, and you learn how to play. And okay, after I was done with the book, I started making up little songs, and I would sing them, for my mother or my father, and of course they would clap. I mean, what else are they going to do? They're not going to boo me. And then when my grandmother came over, I would play them for her, and sometimes she would join me on the piano. And she was a great pianist. She was much better B3 player. At least I appreciated her more as B3 player. So I wrote this one song. I fell in love with dominant seventh chords at 10, 11 years old. I just thought that was the coolest sound. And I didn't know until later it was because of the tritone, which has always been my favorite interval in the entire spectrum of music. And so I wrote this song called Listen. And my mother had company one day, one of her church friends, and she said, "You know what? We need some music for our tea. We're having a tea. Would you like to play?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "We can pay you." And I thought, they're going to pay me. It never dawned on me until I got there that I was going to be on stage playing in front of people. That part just went right over my head. All I saw was the money, and I could play a dominant seventh chord. And I went to a place that's still standing called the Tiki Room. That's where the tea was. And if you can imagine all these ladies with white gloves on, it was a lady sodality from the church, and they all had on hats and this and that. And my mother dressed me in a pink lace dress. To this day, I hate pink with a passion. I used to always tease her that I was going to go on the Oprah Winfrey Show and say that I'm a basket case because she dressed me in so much pink. And I had on a pair of pink cat-eye glasses, and I had these pink gloves. And I was trying to tell her I can't play guitar without the gloves. Well, just keep them on until you walk on stage. And I was so embarrassed for those stupid gloves. Anyway, so I walk out and I play this Listen piece. No, before that, I start tuning up, and my G string broke. And I burst into tears. And my teacher had always told us to carry an extra set of strings. And I didn't have my extra set of strings. And so the lady who hired me, her name was Equilla Cox. I never forget that name. She came up to me and said, "Now we're paying you to play. You're going to have to stop crying and get busy because, the event will be over and you'll still be up here crying." So I said, "Okay." And, it was embarrassing enough that I had this stupid pink ruffled dress. And then when I sat down, it was like ruffles everywhere. I just wanted to snatch it off. And then I got these stupid little ankle socks on with ruffles and all this. It was horrible. So I started playing, and I was trying to explain to her that I needed that string in order to play my tritone. But she was like, "Well, just play all the other strings." And I thought, oh, God. So what it did is it made me learn alternate fingerings, for chords. But at the time, I only knew certain chords. And so I played it, and I actually, sang the whole thing. And then when I finished, I said, "Okay, we're going to finish off the afternoon." They said, "Finish off the afternoon? You want to play one piece?" I didn't do any more singing after that. I just played instrumental. And, guitar is one of those instruments that you can do that. You can, play something really hard and fast, or you can do something easy. And that was kind of an easy listening crowd anyway. So I got through that, and they gave me my money. And from that point on, I always carried an extra set of guitar strings. But it was my first gig, and it was the first time that I realized, you know what? I think I want to do this. I was a composer before I knew what a composer was, but I knew that I wanted to do that, not just play the guitar, not just sing. I want to be able to make that music. I want to be able to sit down with an idea. And to me, it seemed like listening was always the lesson that teachers were trying to tell. Make sure you're listening to yourself, listening to other people. And I think that's why that was the name of the first tune that I wrote, called Listen. It kind of clicked with me. I never realized until maybe I was in high school, or high school going into college, I might not be able to eat doing this. I might not have a place to stay.
Right.
This is not like other kids' dreams, of being an accountant or a firefighter. They can get a job. But I didn't really care. I just thought, you know what? I'll do the music. Everything else will come. And I think that's kind of how I've lived my life. I've been really fortunate that I found things to do where I can sustain myself physically, make a living or whatever, and still keep the music going. I have a lot of friends who've made some really tough decisions, and the music lost, and so did they. I think it's sad that the world requires that we make those choices. And I know it's not just musicians, it's all of the arts, but there's no, and I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, there's not one thing that's important in people's lives that they don't consciously think of music. When people are born, there's always music. When they're baptized, there's music. When they get married, there's music. When they have a party, there's music. When they have a funeral, there's music. And yet, people don't really appreciate the music. They don't really appreciate it. I've had people say so many silly and insane things. Like my teacher, Hale Smith, was telling me he was playing a gig once, and he said to the club owner, you really have to get the piano tuned, man. I can't come in here night after night and play that. It's really bothering me. And he said, bothering you how? He said, well, it sounds horrible. It's not in tune. Well, that's what I'm paying you for, to make it sound good. It was like, okay, when someone says that to you, you know that you cannot really converse with that person. What can you say to let them know that a piano needs to be tuned? That shows you how people have such disregard for music. That's why music appreciation classes are so important. And I can't stand it when faculty members fight not to teach music appreciation. Wow, you have a golden opportunity to reach the non-musicians, because they're the ones who are going to buy the tickets. When I look at the audience, most of the people that come to my concerts, they're not musicians. All the musicians are either on stage or they're doing their own thing. It's the non-musicians that you have to reach so they can realize how integral music is to their lives and why it's so important to support it. And I think if more people had just a good music appreciation foundation, music wouldn't end up on the cutting room floor so much. You could probably count the people on one hand with fingers left over who are not walking around with headphones on. If people were that plugged in, pun intended, when it comes to funding music or supporting music, or even in academia, fighting to teach music appreciation, that's where the real change is going to take place, I think.
Yeah.
There has to be a paradigm shift, because we have to reinvent ourselves, especially singers. I don't know what their future is going to look like. Choral singers, ensemble singers, because singing is at the top of the list for spreading COVID-19. We've got to do something. So that puts a composer in a position too. I have a commission to write an opera, and I'm so grateful that I had the wherewithal to say to the guy, I'm not interested in writing a 2-hour opera. I'm not interested in writing a 3-act opera. I will write a micro opera for you. He goes, a micro opera? What is that? And he knew what it was. I mean, he's a singer. I think it's the Aaron Copland Foundation that has a fund called Second Performances. And they give money to people just for second performances, because composers write music that usually only gets one performance. And I'm not interested in investing that kind of time. I have too many things on my plate. I have so many things that I want to do before I die. And if I die tomorrow, then that's cool. But if I live a long and fruitful life, I'd like to think that I didn't spend time writing 10 operas that will never see the light of day.
Opera especially is a good case study of how composers adjust to modern tastes, but also, like you say, just the capability of groups to put on pieces. You know, there aren't that many opera companies out there that can make long, like the independent ones that will do non-canon opera. They don't have the funding to do huge productions, and the ones who have the funding to do huge productions are stuck in the 1950s, you know, like in terms of programming.
Yeah, unless you're John Adams or someone.
Right.
I was happy to see that Anthony Davis. I was happy to see that he won a Pulitzer Prize because, he's written several operas. People probably don't even know that. But I'm sure even he fights for performances.
I did want to talk a little bit about the music itself. First, I just wanted to mention how much I enjoyed learning and playing your organ piece that I performed a couple of years ago.
Thank you.
I'm so glad that Twitter exists just because that was how I met you and you let me know about your piece. It was the most challenging piece on that program for me to play. It's it's written very idiomatically for the instrument. When I got it and I was looking at it, I was like, okay, I can do this. Unfortunately, a lot of 21st century pieces, especially written for organ, the person maybe has been near an organ like once or twice. They don't really understand the mechanics of it, and it's not an easy instrument to write for. And I do want to ask you about how you wrote that. But yeah, just to finish my thought there, it was challenging, but it was in a way that was really fun for me because it was written so well for the instrument. So
oh my goodness, thank you.
Especially that there's a really contrapuntal section where I'm moving my feet in fourths and fifths, and I'm just, as I was playing it, I'm like, how am I even doing this? Like, this is so I'm like proud of myself for doing it.
Oh, that's good.
So I really enjoyed the piece, but I am curious your experience with the pipe organ specifically, because that is a totally different beast from the B3, and I would love to learn B3. I've never really had the opportunity to do it. Yeah, I know you wrote it for a specific organist, and so I guess I was just curious about that process.
It's interesting because I had some technical difficulties, so I wanted to print out a list of my works, and I wanted to print out a bio and other things to have in front of me, because when I'm talking, I usually forget who I am and what I've written. But I just happened to have some paper on my desk because it needs to be cleaned. And one of them is the program notes for Doxology, my organ piece. I'm glad that that's there because there were a few organists that I sat with. First of all, the guy who commissioned me to write the piece, I cannot even remember his name, and that doesn't bother me as much as it should, but no, the reason it doesn't bother me is because after I wrote the piece, he looked at it and he said, and he's a well-known organist, I will not call his name, and he said, that's not good enough for me to play.
Oh, yeah, let's not
and
say his name at all.
Crushed. God,
That's
I was
horrible.
crushed. I was crushed.
Oh.
Thank God we were on the phone so he couldn't see my face melting. Oh my God, I was so hurt.
How awful.
And I said, okay, it was a specific project. He commissioned several composers for a recording that he was doing and a publication. And he was so excited when he found my name because he was looking for a Black female composer. And I guess I just made an assumption that I was in.
Well, yeah. You
I was
would.
so out. But you know what? Oh, now I remember his name. Oh my God. I remember his initials. Now I can't get it out of my head. But anyway, I'm kind of glad it happened because it was a very humbling experience. But what it made me do was to revisit all the organists that I talked to and sit down with them at the organ One of my best friends, which I wrote all of my clarinet music for, he's a choral conductor, Richard Nunley. He also plays organ. He's one of those people that people love to hate. He's got a beautiful baritone voice. He's left-handed, so he's a left-handed conductor. He's also a right-handed conductor.
Oh, wow.
Piano. He plays organ. Plays clarinet. All the entire clarinet family. He plays bassoon. So it's like, okay, what doesn't he do?
Right.
The same thing that Hale Smith has always said to me, Regina, don't ever doubt yourself. This guy's a jerk. He probably bit off more than he can chew. And this was his way of eliminating you. Or maybe, he could have found a kinder way to say, I'm sorry, but the project ran over and I had to cut a piece and yours was. But to say that this doesn't measure up kind of thing. And so Richard Nunley, who doesn't really play organ that much, because, with all his talents, he has to choose. And he's primarily a choral conductor. He sat down with the piece when it was finished. He saw the piece in one of its many drafts. At the time, I was working as a children's choir director at a church here in Chicago. The organist there, I didn't really know him that well. Zanimir Nagy is his name. And the reason I didn't know Zanimir that well is because I was working at the morning mass with the children, and he worked in the afternoon mass. So we never crossed paths. I just knew who he was, and occasionally, if something happened, they would ask me to sub for him. But I never played organ. Subbing for him just meant providing worship music. But they never asked him to sub for me because he wouldn't have done it. He was one of those very proper Russian organists. And Zvonimir was cool because he worked at 3 different churches and he sat with me at 3 different organs. And that was really helpful to me because when I think of organ, for me, organ is the first synthesizer,
Yes.
So I love that fact that you have this orchestra at your fingertips and that like drums, drum set, drum kit, it requires all 4 limbs. I really like that about it. One of my earliest memories of my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, is that we would go to Catholic Mass in the morning, and when I was a kid, the Masses were still said in Latin.
Wow.
Yeah, Masses were said in Latin. And then they switched to the vernacular probably when I was in maybe grade or 4th or 5th grade or whatever it was. The Latin Masses were very, kind of rigid. The priest had his back to the congregation throughout the entire Mass unless he was passing out communion. And even then, you never looked at him. He never looked at you. Then we would, in the afternoon, my sisters and I, the 3 big ones, we would walk my grandmother to church. And my grandmother was a member of the Church of God in Christ. And I don't know if you know about the Church of God in Christ. Church of God in Christ is, we used to call it the sweat back your hair church. Because you would go in there and the ladies were all dolled up and the men were buttoned down. And by the time they finished shouting and doing their holy dancing, everybody was sweating. And my sisters and I used to, the diction of the choir was horrible. And we would make fun of them, just sing any nonsense syllables, because that's how they sounded to us. But the most engaging thing for me, and I don't think anybody noticed it because there was so much going on, I would sit down at my grandmother's feet. I was just so enamored with the fact that her feet could move that fast playing a bass line. And now that I think about it, she was clapping feet and doing all kinds of stuff. My grandmother was like in her 60s, 70s when she was doing this. And I thought, wow, she's able to do this, And I think she was in her 80s when she died. And sometimes my grandmother would be playing the organ and she would be shouting. So her upper body's doing one thing, the footboard, she's doing something else. And I just thought, wow, what a cool instrument. What a cool instrument. And she was playing B3. In the Catholic church that I went to, they had B3 and they had pipe organs. They also had electric organs. That foot pedaling, I just loved it. And I love the fact that the pedals were so big. It looks like a piano, but it's not. But at the same time, it was very daunting to try to write for organ. I thank all these people. I'm grateful that I have this thing in front of me. Carl Chaddock was another organist who sat with me. Carl was so interested in this piece because he was a member of AGO, American Guild of Organists. And the same year that the person who commissioned the piece rejected, Carl said, I called him because I asked a friend of mine, a non-musician. He asked me for some music for one of his films. He's a filmmaker. And nothing panned out. But he said, I have a friend you might be interested in meeting. Carl, he's an organist. So Carl sat with me. Carl says, you know what? We have an AGO meeting coming up. It's a big anniversary, and we're looking to do more music by Black composers. Would you think you might have this piece ready? I said, it's ready now. So he's like, meet me at my church. So he looked through, he's like, oh, this is beautiful. It's fabulous. So I said, okay. I said, are you going to play it? He says, oh, no, I could never play this. And I said, why not? He said, I'm not an organist, I'm a pianist. I said, but you just play through it. He was like, yeah, I was just sight reading. But he said, I play organ in my church, but I don't play organ in public. I mean, not as an organist, you know. And I know how that means. I mean, because I've done things where the organist didn't show up and I was a choir director and I had to start the mass or whatever. So you sit down. In my case, you play 5-1 in the foot pedal and that's it. That's all you're getting out of me.
That's good.
Oh yeah, 5-1. You know, and if I felt really fancy, or if there was a plagal cadence, then I got to go 4-1. But other than that, no, I wasn't doing the stuff my grandmother was doing. But Carl he said, I want to take this to an AGO meeting and see what they say. Well, they voted unanimously to premiere this piece.
Oh, wonderful.
I said, oh, this would be great. So my mom was taking organ lessons, and by then she was retired. She was maybe in her 60s or 70s. One of the guys at the church where she worked, which I also used to work there, Tom Weisflog is his name. He was organist at St. Thomas Apostle Church and also at the University of Chicago, Rockefeller Chapel. And so she said, Tom, my daughter's writing an organ piece. You think you might take a look at it? And he said, sure. Is it like a modern 20th century organ piece? And she said, well, she does write modern music, but her music is nice. And he said, well, of course, you're her mother. And Tom and I had known each other. But anyway, so he looked at the piece and he was like, oh, my God, I got to play this. And I said, well, AGO is going to premiere it. And then, well, the University of Chicago is not to be outdone. So they called me and said, we want to premiere the piece. And I was like, oh, well, I had kind of promised AGO. So I called AGO and I said, would you mind if you could say that you are premiering the piece at your meeting? Would it be okay? Or do you just want to do the world premiere? They said, oh, no, that's cool. I was like, oh, good, because I have a chance to make some money and do a concert. They did like a half a dozen performances in Rockefeller Chapel. And the organ had just been redone, and they made this big deal out of it. We're so grateful to invite a woman composer here. This is the first concert we've done on our refurbished organ. And I just thought I had died and gone to organ heaven. It was fabulous. And then I've got a couple other people, Campbell McNeil. Campbell McNeil worked for a UCC church and in Chicago here. And he's one of these people, he loved French organ music. He was a very formal man. He just thought, and he was also Black. For this music to come from a Black person, oh my God, you know, the skies have parted and the sun is shining down on me and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, I was so happy when you called me because I said, all these men are playing this piece. And whenever I asked a female organist, one person told me, oh my God, I like to wear dresses when I play organ. That's not a dress wearing organ piece. And I thought, okay, that's kind of silly.
She's not playing Bach either then.
No. I think that was an easy way of saying it. I don't want to spend the time to work it up.
Oh.
But anyway, so when you offered to play this, I was just so thrilled to death.
Oh, I'm glad.
Now your name is in the program notes.
That's awesome. I wanted to ask about something you did recently, which you so generously sent me, your Variations in Black Music collection. I'm just curious about how that came about and the inspiration behind it, because like Helen Walker Hill mentions, and like you mentioned, and here you draw from many different sort of Black music traditions, and that is sort of reflected in this Variations in Black Music. So I guess if you could talk about that a little bit.
Variations in Black Music. I belong to an organization. It's the National Association of African American Musicians. And they celebrated their 100th anniversary in 2019. They were founded in 1919. I probably have been a member now for maybe about 10 years. And they had always asked me to join, and I just didn't feel like I wanted to belong to a group like that. And it's not just them, it's other people too. I've been asked to join the AACM, and I always felt like groups like that are hard to be in because it's hard being around musicians in association setting on a regular basis. With 6 Degrees, the group that I founded, I always feel like I'm herding cats, but I know when to take off the kid gloves. I know how to say to them, you have 5 minutes and 5 minutes only on the program. We are not going to hold the audience hostage. I've been to concerts by both of those previous groups, and they know that I love them, I support them. But I've been to concerts where my husband has a thing when we go to a concert. If he says, I'll be right back, that means I better have a ride home or way home because he's had his fill. And he's not coming back. But I'll be right back. That's all he says. I live down the street from Orchestra Hall, so he knows that I can walk home or I can take a bus, and by the time I sit down, it's time for me to get off the bus. But if we're out in the middle of nowhere, that's my cue that we are leaving. And usually he's pretty tolerant, but when he gets into a third or fourth hour, he's done.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he will not last 4 hours, I can tell you that. But even my friend's funeral that was in Metropolitan Church, she was an AACM member. The funeral in the church was about 4.5 hours long. And they left there and they went to the school where she taught, a school that was founded by Haki Matabuti. He and his wife founded 4 or 5 different Afrocentric schools, and she was the music department at one school, not a music teacher, the music department. And so they went back to the school where she taught, and they had I think it was a 13-hour jam session. And I talked to people afterwards, and I said, hey, how was the jam session at Betty Shabazz? And one girl told me, I didn't get home till 1:30. I thought, oh my God, Greg never would have made that, 1:30, And it was raining cats and dogs that day, but I had the wherewithal to tell them ahead of time that I would not be there because I knew the funeral would be long. And it's one of those things where every musician in the house had to play. And I think for me, because one of my lifetimes or one of my livelihoods, I was director of public relations. And I'm always very conscious of people's time. I like to respect people. I'm not stupid. I know that 1 hour of new music is about all that the average layperson can take. And I have composer friends, one person, Gary Powell Nash. I name his name hoping to shame him and to never sing this again. And he said to me once when he came to one of my concerts, I said, oh, so what did you think? Because he was like avoiding me. I said, so what did you think? And he says, well, I'm just going to come out with it. I think any concert that is shorter than 2 hours is not respectable.
Oh, geez.
And I said, Gary, I said, that's why you always play to empty houses and why I have a full house. Because people know that I'm not going to hold them hostage. If the women in 6 Degrees or Gary Powell Nash ever hear this interview, they'll know that I fight them tooth and nail. 60 minutes. That is from downbeat to cutoff. Not 60 minutes worth of music where you've got to change and do this and that. So in other words, we're talking about 40 to 50 minutes worth of music. I like brevity. My opera was 2 hours long when I first wrote it. The second performance was underwritten by the Reader's Digest Lila Wallace Foundation. Lila Wallace came to me and said, we would like a 1 hour version of your opera. I was like, what? What are you talking about? 1 hour version of my opera is 2 hours long. And they said, yeah. Can you do it without sacrificing the integrity of the piece? Well, someone writes you a blank check.
You make it happen.
That's right. And that's what I did. And when I looked at that 1 hour performance, the 2 hour performance has never seen the light of day since. Because if you can say it in an hour, why would you say it in 2 hours?
Right. For me, that's also always been my ethos for if I'm putting on a concert is, you're not going to hold the audience hostage. You're not going to, force them past their limit, you always want to leave them wanting more.
Exactly. And that's what I was taught in music school. Start with something that they will remember, the motif or whatever, and always leave them wanting more. Now, that practical side of composition in no way does it force me to compromise the integrity of the music, getting back to Variations in Black. So that's how that book came together. I wanted to put together something for this National Association of African American Musicians convention to sell at the convention. They'd always asked me to come to the convention. I never went because they always go to different cities. It's around my birthday and my anniversary. I couldn't afford it. I didn't want to drag my husband for our anniversary to a stupid music convention, though I've been to enough engineering conventions. So this one was in Chicago, down the street from my house. I didn't have an excuse. It was the best thing I ever did. I got to meet so many musicians that you just don't even know. You would never dream that, oh my God, this was written by that person. Or, I got to meet people like Joseph Joubert, whose work I had always admired, but didn't, had never gotten a chance to meet him. I got to meet a woman called Linda Twine, who I did not know. She's a composer who was in most of the orchestral pits on Broadway, Bubbling Brown Sugar, or just all the Broadway plays that had predominantly Black cast.
Yeah.
As a classically trained music director was going on sabbatical and said, hey, I want you to sub for me. And she said, oh, okay, you need a pianist? And they said, yeah, I need a pianist, but it really pianist, music director / arranger. And it was a jazz show, but she didn't know that until she got there. And she was like, oh, I've never played jazz before. And he said, it's the same as classical. You just got to know how to swing. He got her started, and he made a tape for her. She imitated the tape. She did the gig, and she was bitten by the bug. 40 years later, she had all this stuff under her belt because someone wanted to take a break. And thank God that he called her, because in those days, because Linda's probably 10 or 15 years older than I am, she was probably one of the only women in that pit at the helm. I mean, they had female flute players or female violinists, but even if you were a female tuba player, no one's going to call you. That's not your instrument. That's a man's instrument. And, why is she at the podium? And, she said, I didn't even own a baton when I got that gig. Didn't even own a baton. Didn't dawn on her that she would need a baton until she went to the dress rehearsal, and they were like, I can't see your hands. Well, of course not. And she was like, oh. And she said, maybe I should wear some white gloves. And then, the director said, maybe you should get a baton. She was like, oh, okay. Those are the people that I met at this convention that really, I had known about NAM, National Association of African American Musicians, as a child, but just didn't seem like my cup of tea. I'm glad I went. It led to a lot of relationships that I'm still cultivating. And I sold, some copies of Variations in Black Music. And again, it's a compilation. I think I started with Ajareta, which is a solo piano piece that I dedicated to Hale Smith, my mentor and master composer and great friend. And I ended with a piece called Dreamweaver, which is a jazz piece. I think it's important for a composer, if that is what he or she hears or wants to do, to write different types of music. When I was in the academy, I was told by one of my composition teachers, I wrote I think it was a gospel piece, and I took it to my lesson, and the protocol was that you put your music on the stand. He was a fabulous piano player, and he would play through, and then he would go and tell you where you could, improve or whatever. And he looked at my piece, he looked at the title, he looked at the directions or whatever, and he balled the paper up and threw it in the basket.
Oh, jeez.
And he said, this is pop shit. We are a conservatory.
Oh my gosh.
You are to write classical music.
Oh.
Don't ever waste my time again. And he stood up as if to dismiss me. And again, I was a ball of tears, and I was a freshman. And I had come from Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School. And, with a name like that, you know what the high school was about. You know what the student body was about. I was used to writing jazz band charts for a jazz band. I was used to writing pieces for string ensemble. I was used to writing classical pieces, marching band pieces. And my band director and my music teachers at Dunbar were so sweet. They actually took my music and put it in the folder with Bach and Sousa and Beethoven. So I just knew this was going to be an extension or continuation of high school. So to have someone ball up a piece of paper and throw it in a basket, and of course he threw it and it popped right in the basket, even though I'm sure if he tried that 100 times, he wouldn't have made that basket.
Right.
And I just went home crying, and I mentioned to my father what happened. And, I tell that story. I told it on the radio once with my teacher, the guy who did it. His name is Robert Lombardo.
Oh.
We actually became friends when I was an adult. But as a young undergrad, I just, thought, oh my God, I'm not going to make it. And that had been my dream, to go and get a degree in composition and theory of music. And my father said, and I don't know where he got this from, he was just such a wise man, but he said, you have to learn how to write your music for yourself. Leave that at home. Write your music for your grade and take that to school. Now, whatever instructions he gives you, you follow those instructions. But if you've got a piece that in your heart of hearts you know you must write, then you write that piece as fervently as you wrote the assignment, using all the tools that he gave you. And so in my mind, I heard that as you have to write head music and you have to write heart music, just like a singer has a head voice and a chest voice. And I learned how to do that. And, one of the reasons I told the story on the radio, he was embarrassed at first, was that he actually taught me something. If someone called me and said, we're commissioning you to write a piece of music, and I can't get into it, I know how to turn that head on. He taught me that. I know how to take those tools, start with an opening gesture, that really catches people's attentions or really grabs them by the throat or whatever your goal is. And I can take a one measure motif and I can blow it up into a 3-hour piece. He taught me how to do that. And he didn't know that he was doing that. The best thing about that story is not so much the head and heart music, but Robert Lombardo, I later found out, I was at the Detroit Symphony Orchestra and they were performing a piece of mine. It was like, big deal for me. And there was another guy on the program. He was from Oberlin. And he said, well, I have a friend in Chicago named Bob Lombardo. Do you know him? And I said, yeah, I do. I said, I studied with him. And he said, oh, what a fine man. And he was talking, and of course, I, can't think of anything good to say. You just keep your mouth closed. I have one of those faces, I can't hide things. And he said, you got to tell me about this guy. And I said, what do you mean? You said you know him. And he said, I know him as a student. And I said, oh. And he said, yeah, he studied with me 10 summers. I said, oh, what did he study? He said, gospel and jazz. I said, really?
What?
Really?
Plot twist.
And he said, yes. And when I told him my story, he said, my wife told me when she first met him, I don't like that guy. And he said, you don't even know him. You just met him. She said, I don't like him. And, it was so weird because when I found out that he was studying gospel and jazz, I asked him about it. And why did you react to my music that way? Or why were you studying jazz if that's the way you felt about it? And, he didn't really have an answer per se, but it was just one of those things where this is what I was taught. This is how I taught you. I only studied jazz and blues because I loved it and I wanted to know how to write it. And I guess a part of me was a little jealous that here's this 17-year-old kid coming in here, smashing it in my face, that she can write gospel music or jazz and I can't. Well, I mean, if you grow up in an environment that I grew up in, it's like Ulysses K. He was a classical composer, but his uncle was W.C. Handy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he made the conscious choice. He did not want to write blues. He was a classical composer. That's where his heart was. That's where he resonated with that music. He didn't resonate with W.C. Handy. And I remember people, when I met Ulysses K. and I asked him about the story that I read, where his family said, if you can't write, music of our culture, then I don't want you writing music. I think his parents told him that. And W.C. Handy stood up for him and said he has to write what his heart tells him to write, because if you force him into something, it's not going to work. So that's why I'm so adamant about variations in Black music or variations in music. I look at Rachel Barton Pine. She's a classically trained violinist. She loves heavy metal. She loves jazz. She loves blues. And so I think if that's your calling, if that's what you want to do, I think it's important for aspiring musicians to see that it's possible.
Thank you, Regina Harris Baiocchi, for being on Sound Meets Sound podcast. It's been a huge honor and so cool to hear from your own lips about these experiences that I read, some of which I read about from Spirituals to Symphonies.
Well, thank you, Meg. It's been my pleasure. And I'm grateful that people are interested in hearing about music and the composition process.
Now let's listen to a selection of live performances of Regina's work, starting with the fourth movement from Sketches for Piano Trio, performed by the Lincoln Trio. This is followed by the third movement from Hummingbird, written for piano duo and performed by Winston Choi and Kuang Hao Huang. Dreamweaver, performed by Susan Warmington, Matana Roberts, and Ester Hana. And to finish, Ask Him, performed by Roberta Thomas, Ester Hana, Ben Willis, and Michael Adams.
Help me weave a dream.